This episode contains descriptions of chemical weapons and death. Discretion is advised.
This perhaps started in January of 1963 when an employee of a factory in Smarden called in the local veterinary surgeon, Douglas Good, and he asked Good to look at two of his dogs who had died.
Douglas Good lived in the rural village of Smarden, Kent. All around him, the animals started to behave erratically. They might pace the ground, run away, or become overly thirsty. And then they'd die.
Several months later in May, he's called to several farms. Animals have died. Goats have died. Sheep have died. Some of them are in the throes of death when he comes. And he discovers from another local vet, Jones, who has visited a farm again, this time a farm with cows, Friesians. The cows again are displaying similar symptoms, are in the throes of death, and some of them die shortly thereafter.
Whatever was killing them left no trace, and it terrified the people in the village of Smarden. One housekeeper described what happened to her dog. At 1 a.m. he jumped onto my bed, a thing he never does, his eyes staring and big, trembling a little and teeth bared as he panted and seemed mad. I was frightened. I let him out of the bedroom, and he fell downstairs, stumbles out of the doors, and went onto the green. There he fell over, head bent backwards, and his legs kicking as he gasped for air. A horrible noise came from his throat, and his eyes were very big. Then he got up, looking wildly around, and shot away, and we did not see him alive again. Douglas Good added to the report, the foxhound's actions were suggestive of fearful hallucinations. The following morning he was found drowned in a pond. The post-mortem revealed nothing unusual. The farmer even rejected Douglas Good's official post-mortem certificate, death by drowning. Historian and author John Clarke.
And the vets decide that this is too much of a coincidence, and he has his suspicions as to what is causing this.
Douglas Good would eventually take to the papers to describe what he called the perfect poison. He writes, "Criminologists are continually on the alert for new types of poisons which might be used in irresponsible hands for committing the perfect murder. Some of the requirements for such a poison include the following. First, it should be inconspicuous, particularly in regard to odour and taste. Second, it should be sufficiently stable to withstand rather drastic conditions, such as suspension in hot tea or boiling coffee. Third, it should operate with a delayed action in order that the murderer cover his tracks before death occurs. Fourth, the poison should induce no obvious pathological changes, which could be spotted at post-mortem examination. And lastly, fifth, there should be no reliable means of analysing for residual traces of that poison in the body of the victim."
The other thing that's very important to mention is between January, when Good first looks at these dogs, and then May, when he sees other farm animals, he most likely reads Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. It's published in the UK in February 1963.
A vet, a book, and more than 100 mysterious animal deaths combined to form a sensational and national story. When it reaches its peak, 10 government institutions have to get involved. My name's Laura Cole, and this is On the Ground by Geographical Magazine. Strangely, Douglas Good had actually seen these kinds of effects on animals before.
I was astonished by the coincidences that started to come to the fore.
Before he lived in Kent, he'd actually worked in South Africa with a scientist named D.G. Stein. Stein was a pioneer researcher on plant poisonings in South Africa. His work resulted in the recognition and then the avoidance of many South African plants, which can cause similar behaviours in animals before they die. A plant they probably looked at, gifbla, is Afrikaans for poison. Today it still causes an outsized number of cattle deaths. Stein, his former colleague, was an expert on the active chemical component of these plants, a fluorine compound, which would shut down the vital organs of animals.
So he's had this exposure, if you like, to fluorine compounds and the effects they've had on domesticated animals prior to what happens in Smarden.
So when he's visiting these farms, he's looking for plants that all the fields might have in common. He notices that the grasses are blackened, but he notices the fields have something else in common. a series of drainage ditches that ultimately connect to an unassuming looking building, a factory.
So they start to suspect it's something at the factory that's poisoning these animals. And they contact their regional veterinary officer, who in turn then calls in the Ministry of Agriculture.
The small factory had been run by a company called Rentokil for 3 years, who were using it for the light manufacture of pesticides and rodenticides. He immediately calls the Kent River Board, who have a duty to prevent the pollution of streams. Good then goes directly to Rentokil about the deaths. The manager tells him, "We're not discharging any chemical effluent to ditches on our property, but are carting all effluents away or evaporating them to dryness. I consider it impossible that even in cases of gross negligence or carelessness, any chemical effluent could be discharged from here. In other words, it's not us." So this is starting to happen in the 1960s, and at that time, British farming is going through a pretty intense transformation, and chemicals were a big part of it.
The UK is leading in Western Europe in terms of its embrace of intensive farming. And by intensive farming, I mean the application of machinery. And really, if you think about it, think about agribusiness in a sense. We talk about farms disappearing, and certainly small farms start to disappear, but large farms start to proliferate. And if you want to manage those large farms and monocultures, machinery and chemicals seem perfect, because you can also have a reduction of labor. You don't need as many hands to work the farm. If you have these chemical fertilizers, if you have machinery, and then subsequently chemical fertilizers seem to work pretty well, you have these chemicals in terms of pesticides. And I think it's important to think about that context too. This is part of a business. This is agribusiness.
This embrace of tech and chemicals means the UK is in the lead per capita in terms of production, second only to the Netherlands. Between 1930 and 1970, cereal production increases threefold. It's in this scene that pesticides are really becoming mainstream. Numbers vary depending on crops, but according to John, in general about 90% of cereals, vegetables, fruit trees and bushes were being treated with them.
I think one thing we can read from it is just how many different chemicals are in use by the time we get to the early 1960s.
Sabine Clarke, pesticides historian at the University of York.
So we've gone from DDT in 1945, and ICI had a product called BHC, which is very similar to DDT. So there are two of these brand new synthetic chemicals on the market. And then by the time we get to about 1960, there's about 500. So there's been this massive explosion in the number of chemicals that chemical companies are now marketing to farmers and to householders and gardeners and all sorts of people.
Proliferation of chemicals in the 20th century was astonishing.
Pesticides were everywhere, and some were stronger than others.
The ultimate insecticide means that it persists, so it's there, it will keep killing the insects. It seems to have no or a negligible effect on the health of humans.
This was the market that Rentokil was in. There's kind of a crazy story within a story here.
If I give you an anecdote I shouldn't give. One of the guys who was initially just in the process of setting up Rentokil in early 1920s, Harold Maxwell Lefroy. He was an entomologist who worked at Imperial College.
He was working on an insecticide for houseflies, but he hadn't ventilated the lab, so he ended up poisoning himself. And then he rallied a little bit between the poisoning and dying.
And at the inquest, the person who had found him was giving evidence, and they said, "Did he have any last words?" He said, "Yes, he did." He said, "The little beggars got me this time."
Wow.
So, yep.
I've never heard that story before. There was an industry in Britain for chemicals called fluoracetates.
It is a toxin. Part of the legacy of a lot of these pesticides goes back to chemical warfare, and that's where this chemical was largely developed.
During the late 1930s, a group of Polish scientists were looking at tear gases made with iodine, except it kept resulting in giveaway purple clouds, which could have warned troops in a battlefield scenario. They swapped it out for fluorine and tested its tear gas capabilities on the eye of a rabbit. There was no tearing, but the rabbit died, so attentions turned to fluorine compounds. The workers tested it on a range of animals and found it was highly toxic. after a small wait of 30 minutes to an hour, it would result in heart failure, convulsions, and breathing problems, then death. During the war, the Polish scientists fled to Britain and shared their work with a secret unit at Cambridge University. Once the war was over, the group would discover what was so toxic about fluoracetates. Fluoracetate is not toxic as it is. It's a Trojan horse substance. The time lag for symptoms to set in is down to the fact it changes in the body to fluorocitrate, and it gets everywhere, and in doing so blocks a vital cycle for cells. Cells are constantly cycling through energy in this engine room called the citric acid cycle, which you can imagine as a Ferris wheel of chemical reactions. Fluorocitrate mimics natural citrate and takes its place. The natural citrate has nowhere to go, so it builds up in the body. It can affect or stop the heart beating. Meanwhile, cells are starved of the energy they need to survive. It leads to organ failure. It wasn't used in a war scenario, but reading some of their papers, what keeps being repeated is that it's hard to detect, pervasive in the environment, and there's no antidote. In Smarden, they still didn't know what was entering the water. Do you know if they said at any point, any of the government ministries said to the farmers in Smarden that they shouldn't be continuing to produce milk or consuming of the livestock would be unsafe?
No, it's a really good question. And it is interesting, this story, because the government seems to be almost contradictory. They want to be done with it quickly, but at the same time, they don't want to make too many public declarations for fear of litigation from the pesticide firm. They also, you think of all the ministries that are involved, once you start reading the papers that exist, you realize they're trying to keep the Ministry of Health from the limelight.
Here's where it gets a bit interesting. Douglas Good starts to do his own investigation. He enlists the help of a lab who arrive on the scene with a black box and apparently declare within minutes that it's fluorocetamide in the water. It's kind of an unusual thing to do. This lab uses something called radionics. It wasn't respected at the time, and it's since been seen as a kind of quack endeavour. At the same time, he's still talking about it to the British Veterinary Association and the local press, but on the ground, it doesn't seem like there's much movement. No one seems to have any answers. It's probably worth at this point talking about the legal context. How would the government tackle a mysterious poisoning like this? The context is actually nuisance, which sounds like a silly word, but it carried a lot of weight in the 19th century around smoke pollution, and it continued being the defining environmental legislation even by the 1960s.
Nuisance has a legal meaning, but we can just reduce it to it doesn't smell or it doesn't make noise. And because this chemical doesn't smell and it doesn't make a noise in terms of its production, it's probably okay. Which, again, tells you something about grappling with toxins in the environment, poisons in the environment. People are used to thinking about what they can see, what they can feel, what they can smell. It's these hidden dangers that they're grappling with now. There's always a riding clause in much of this legislation that says, they can act against them if they haven't taken the best practicable means to mitigate the pollution. Well, that's pretty hard to pin down. So even in 1962, 63, 64, when they go in and look at the factory, when they inspect, the factory isn't even fully functioning. So it's not up and running when they inspect, but they look at all the machinery and they say all the machinery constitutes best practicable means to mitigate pollution. So they're okay.
There's also a chemical notification scheme, which was introduced in around 1955. It's relatively new.
But I think what's key about the British approach, which does make Britain different to a lot of other countries, is this is all entirely voluntary. So it relies upon an informal agreement between British manufacturers and government.
What was that relationship like?
Almost a cliche here, but there's this incredibly cosy relationship between government officials and, the sort of people who work for companies such as ICI. So we're talking, until the 60s, we're talking about a chemical manufacturing sector in Britain, which is largely British-based firms. So there's almost like a national chemical industry, if you like. And so the people who work in those companies are really good friends with people who work in Whitehall. And so you see records in the archives of people having dinners together or going to their club and having drinks. And I think while it sort of looks really problematic, I think there was a belief at the time that this incredibly close and very friendly relationship was a positive, that it was much better to work with the manufacturers in this positive and non-combative and non-adversarial way. And government was much more likely to use gentle persuasion to get them to do the right thing than, if you like, the threat of legal action and so forth. And also, I think, it had the advantage of keeping a lot of controversy out of the public gaze, right? And so with fluorocetamine, there's every likelihood they had a conversation that said this product could be dangerous. However, if you use it like this, it'll be fine.
So it's quite laissez-faire, essentially.
Maybe we could say they were shockingly happy to wait for something terrible to happen before they resorted to more substantial forms of intervention.
In July, the Ministry of Agriculture, Fisheries and Food discover the factory has only recently begun to cart its waste away. Before that, there was clear evidence that the land at the back of the factory had been used as a general dumping ground. There were rusting metal drums, black sludge, all near to the ditches that were connecting to this farmland. The inspection takes water samples, but it would take several months to process. Rentokil denies everything, that they had ever dumped any waste from the manufacture of fluorocetamide. They claimed no knowledge of this being done by an employee without their authority. It also seems there's a lack of awareness about the variation between these chemicals.
They sent in the chief medical officer from the Ministry of Health. I'm not sure he fully grasps. I think Good grasps more correctly. And Good's aware that this is an organic fluorine compound.
The medical officer seems to think it's an inorganic fluorine compound, like the sodium fluoride in toothpaste.
He was saying no problem at all. You can ingest all kinds of this stuff.
Ministry for Housing is saying it's a one-off incident that couldn't have been foreseen.
It's done. It's over. And of course, it's not done and it's not over.
One night, at the end of September, the residents of the Welsh town of Merthyr Tydfil were settling in for the weekend. Through the night, almost 100 pets fell down dead. Reportedly, one owner lost 14 corgis. In another house, 2 full-grown Alsatians died, with 7 puppies out of a litter of 12. The Sunday Mirror described the animals dying in agony, some of them collapsing after racing wildly through the streets. It's a big story in Sunday papers up and down the country. The National Canine Defence League offers 50 guineas for whoever first identified the exact cause of death. There's an amplified fear of containing whatever is affecting the animals, and the police chase a greyhound for miles over one of the mountains. The day before, the town's medical officer, Thomas Stevens, warned the town on the radio about the possibility of it being raw meat, cautioned anyone from using utensils that had had any contact with pet food. They managed to pare down their investigation to a single source, horse meat from the local pet shop, where the owner was none the wiser. He says, quote, "It is a mystery. I'm very worried about the whole business." Because Smarden's Douglas Good had been talking so broadly about his concerns, he gets a call from the vet, Douglas Phillips, in Merthyr Tydfil. Together the vets contact the veterinary laboratory at Weybridge, which finds that the pony died from ingesting an organic fluorine compound. Good then advises the medical officer, Thomas Stevens, that it's probably fluorocetamide. It's figured out to have been rat poison from a local dump, that the pony must have eaten. So everything starts to compound here. You've got these 2 poisoning events on completely different sides of the country, in different contexts. These shocking stories add real-world, local examples to a book that's come out, Silent Spring, by Rachel Carlson. The book starts with A Fable for Tomorrow, where it reads, "A strange blight crept over the area and everything began to change. Some evil spell had settled on the community. Mysterious maladies swept the flocks of chickens. The cattle and sheep sickened and died. Everywhere was the shadow of death."
It's been called toxic consciousness, that people start to have this toxic consciousness by the 1960s.
Her book really informed the public. And I think what it did is it gave them a really powerful rhetoric that they could deploy of chemicals washing over the countryside, come straight out of Carson. And you see it used in speeches which are made in Parliament, for example.
Sabine says there's a file in the National Archives under the Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Fisheries called Silent Spring, and it's huge.
And it is full of letters from members of the public directly to officials, and they are quoting Silent Spring.
This wasn't the public's introduction to the idea of strong pesticide chemicals. Unlike the US, which was more associated with crop spraying of DDT, the UK was more attached to seed treatments, particularly with dieldrin, and this had already caused a wildlife scandal where first pigeons and pheasants started dying. Then eventually foxes ate those birds and started to die too. But these poisoning cases went from wildlife to field and into people's houses.
I think it so obviously demonstrates to the public how dangerous these chemicals can really be.
To John, it feels like these poisonings gave the previous arguments a new urgency.
Silent Spring really gives good context for this. Because in many ways, if you look at it, we're talking probably about a toxic spill. But that's not how this is contextualized. That's not how this is understood. People start to understand this as part of the mass application of insecticides.
Just a few days later, BBC Radio News conducted an interview with the then Director of Toxicology Research Unit to inform the public about fluorocetamide particularly. He emphasised the variability of toxicity among different species of animals, but when questioned whether it could kill a human being, he confirmed that it could if the dose was large enough. More significantly, though, the idea of chain poisoning was being passed around by the Ministry of Agriculture, Fisheries and Food, where they talked about the risk of poison being passed from cow to milk to child. The government, at this point, is, internally at least, annoyed that the public is connecting these two incidences.
And when you look again at the government correspondence, they're privately bemoaning the fact. They're saying, well, it was okay when it was farm animals, but now that a dog has died, everything has broken loose.
Then something a little bit weird happened. Maybe it's a bit of an about face for Rentokil.
The operator of the dump said, I didn't use fluorocetamide in the dump. Or at least the local council said, we didn't use fluorocetamide in the dump, in the tip. We used warfarin as a rat poison. And Rentokil said, actually, we just sold that local council a huge consignment of fluorocetamide. So.
Smarden still has to deal with the possibility of the chemical's persistence. The final 11 out of the original 26 dairy cow herd was dead. One of the government ministries suggests that the farmers burn the cow carcasses, and a resident describes seeing the smoke column for miles. An officer from the government's animal health division suggests to the farmer that he put on protective gear and bury the animals to 6 feet. The officer said in his report, the knowledge or assumption of non-destruction by cremation of the substance fluorocetamide was held, but not raised by or conveyed to the owner. In other words,
we're pretty certain that burning won't get rid of the fluorocetamide, but we're not about to tell the farmer this.
It gets worse. They get 2 test cows from outside the area and put them on the land. They don't give them access to the water. They're trying to see if the soil and the grass is going to still be poisonous. The cows die in December. Then, to verify that the cows have died from this poison, they feed the meat to the dogs. The dogs die. 4 of them. But the headlines are now entirely anti-chemicals, anti-ministries, and they go overboard.
They report that these dogs have been murdered and the numbers just get inflated. So we have 2 dogs, we have 20 dogs, we have a lorry load of dogs.
Do you think overall this is a sign that these ministries were just unprepared for these kinds of chemicals? Do you think this is a sign they just didn't have a way to deal with it?
Well, they don't, do they? And it's interesting because by the time it's done, it's astonishing how many different ministries of the government are involved. And coordinating them is very difficult. Because, yes, there is no, for instance, designated Minister of the Environment. So they're also struggling with the fact that they don't really have the mechanisms legislatively to deal with it. and they get rather creative.
Some of the ministers discussed how there isn't really a legislation that means they can charge or even stop Rent-A-Kill from continuing. Their workaround is that local government deny consent for Rent-A-Kill's manufacturing of another chemical they had in the pipeline.
And they say, well, the owner of the factory could appeal this and they'd probably win because they have consent for the light manufacture of a chemical. And light manufacture, as far as they're concerned, means it doesn't cause a nuisance.
There wasn't room for any more tension between the government and the public. Then a factory worker got sick. He lived, and it seemed like he had bronchitis. But with everything that had happened, it became a natural crisis point. That February, fluorocetamide was banned as an agricultural and commercial insecticide. Given the chemical is so persistent, 2,000 tons of condemned soil were piled in metal drums, sailed out to the Bay of Biscay, and dumped in the sea. What would you say is the legacy of something like Smarden?
I think it did generally frighten manufacturers. I think it really did. And I think it's the closest we got in the period before 1980 to having statutory legislation. So there was serious discussion about introducing a licensing scheme in Britain. And the manufacturers were up for it because of Smarden. And the reasons why we didn't, it's just not clear why at the last minute that idea was abandoned. I think perhaps because it was believed by government that manufacturers were so alarmed about the impact on their reputations of Smarden that legislation wasn't needed, right? That they were going to self-regulate much better than they had done previously. But yeah, I think it really, really alarmed chemical manufacturers who really thought that their increasingly precarious reputation in the eyes of the British public would be fatally undermined by Smarden.
Along the way, the story had transformed and had become that fable of potential ruin of pesticides. Do you think, coupled with Silent Spring, it changed the debate about these chemicals?
I think the answer is it did not start any debate about insecticides. But what it did do, I think, was bring together a rather disparate range of people who were concerned.
Sabine lists socialist politicians, people from the organic farming movement, and then also people from the more conservative country landowners and gamekeepers who were critical of insecticides because of the way it's harming game.
One individual who deserves far greater attention than she normally gets is the MP Joyce Butler, who was a Labour and Cooperative Party MP for Wood Green in North London. And she's the person who gets the Farm and Garden Chemicals Bill. Basically, her bill makes sure that all labels have to name the active ingredient. And that doesn't sound like a big deal. But what she ensured was that any consumer in Britain who now knew the name of a dangerous chemical because they had read Silent Spring could now look at the label of gardening products and know if that chemical was in the product, which, like 2 years beforehand, quite possibly it wasn't mentioned.
And I think trust is sort of an undercurrent in this entire story. And it's the ebbing away of trust, and trust in our experts in the 60s. And you're seeing experts now conflicting with one another. And people don't know who to trust. Who do you trust? Can you trust science anymore? I think it was part of parliamentary debates, and someone asked a question when they were going to dump the soil in the sea. And he said, we relied upon the experts in the first instance, and that got us into this mess. Now you're asking us to trust the experts that it's okay to dump this in the sea. What are we supposed to do? Who can we trust? And I think that is the essence of some of this story, is just the erosion of trust. And that's only become greater in the decades that have intervened. And I don't think it's a simple reason. I think a lot of things lie behind that, but it's unfortunate where we've ultimately landed.
Douglas Good cuts a bit of a complicated figure. He's a scientist, but he has outlandish methods. He's got this moment of relying on pseudoscience with the black box to identify fluorocetamide. The deduction probably came from his previous work with plants, or more likely from talking to locals about the factory, but he was right in the sense of talking about how dangerous they could be. I wanted to know if John sees any connection to the waves of anti-expertise we sometimes see today.
There's nothing wrong with suggesting or imploring experts, that includes scientists, to openly take responsibility and to be answerable. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think the thing that was happening post-Second World War and really took off in the 60s as part of the overtly countercultural movement was that people started to be much more critical of scientific expertise. And in a sense, we're lost if we start to, again, suggest that what we believe is somehow equivalent to empirical evidence. And I think that's where we've landed, in a sense. People can now say, they believe or don't believe in climate change. Well, is it a belief or is it something based on empirical evidence? Gut instinct isn't good enough. And yet this was the beginning of that in a sense. And I don't think, we contained that one well once the genie got out of the bottle.
It's complicated because, on the other hand, he's very much a hero. He keeps demanding accountability and he keeps pushing for more information and disseminating that.
Well, in that sense, he is a hero, right? Good is a hero in that sense. He is holding people accountable, and I think that was important. You could do counterfactual history. What would have happened if Good hadn't pressed this? Initially, they said nothing like this could have happened because we carted away to a quarry. Well, they weren't doing that. And even when the civil servants came, they said, seriously? There's rusting drums, there's evidence of sludge all around the factory. We know what happened here. So if Good hadn't come in, what would have happened? I mean, this could have been much larger if it continued to occur.
Following summer, taking direct inspiration from Rachel Carson, Douglas Good told a story on BBC Radio. In a similar way, he sets himself up as a storyteller between science and experience. He writes, "The house martins never came this spring, and there was no birdsong in the hedgerows. The only rabbits were a few young ones, picked up dead in ditches. The subject of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring had become a reality here in the heart of the Garden of England." You have been listening to On the Ground by Geographical Magazine. This episode was written and produced by myself, Laura Cole, with edits by Graham Gourlay and Bryony Cottam. Let us know what you think of On the Ground. We're brand new and we'd love to hear your comments or a star review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you like to listen.